Welcome to the Weaver Sews. I'm Daryl Lancaster. Our tunic is slowly taking shape. For this hand-dyed and hand-woven version, I've created a placket opening at the neck, but haven't done the final stitching. I've attached the front to the back at the shoulders, but haven't finished off the yoke facing since that will be done when the hood is installed. There is a pattern for the optional hood in the 700 and 1700 tunic patterns. It is generous in size and has dart shaping at the shoulder lines. The long straight edge is the front of the hood. For ease of finishing and reduced bulk, that edge is cut on the selvage of the cloth. It will be turned under. If you don't have decent selvages or can't otherwise put that straight front on the selvage, add 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters to that line for seam allowance. I've gone ahead and sewn the two small darts at the shoulder line of the hood. I've pressed them towards the front. We covered darts in separate videos. Next, we need to sew the two sections of the hood together. Because this hood is unlined, the seam needs to be finished and clean from both sides of the hood, since the wrong side can show when the hood lays open across the back. When I want both sides to show clean in a garment, I use a flat fell or felled seam. I've done that here with this jacket, where the single layer collar rolls back into a lapel. I used a flat fell or felled seam finish so both the right side and the wrong side of the garment are clean. We will do that on the hood center back seam, except in reverse. When I do a flat felled seam on a hand woven, I try to cut the pattern with a 3/4 inch or 2 centimeter seam allowance. The pattern calls for a 3/4 inch or 2 centimeter seam allowance for the back seam of the hood. I'll be bringing the seam allowances to the wrong side of the hood, but that's the reverse of a typical flat felled seam where the seam allowances usually go towards the right side of the garment, as I did on this jacket collar. I'll be turning under the edge of one of those seam allowances. On a hand woven, this can be pretty tough to do. I'm going to use my trusty bias cut nylon tricot to grab the edge of one of the seam allowances and keep it stable and secure for turning. Here's a bit of spatial gymnastics. It doesn't matter which hood section you do this to, but I'm going to use the left hood so it is consistent with the illustrations in the hood directions. We will only do this to one of the hood sections. You'll see how this all plays out in a minute. I'm going to apply the tricot, as I did with the side seams and lower curves, to help draw up the curve of the hood, which will be important in getting it to lay flat. And I'm going to apply it to the wrong side of the hood. I know, I like playing spatial gymnastics. It's probably the only exercise I get. I want to make sure that only about 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter of the tricot will show when I'm done. Remember that the seam allowances here are 3/4 of an inch or 2 centimeters. On the wrong side of the hood, starting at the back neck, fold the tricot over the edge of the seam allowance only 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters and stitch. Work carefully a couple inches at a time. As you approach the curve of the hood, begin to stretch the tricot slightly and draw up the hood, feeding the curve into the tricot just like we did on the shirt tail hems. When you come out of the curve, resume just carefully folding the tricot over the top edge. Continue all the way to the front edge of the hood. Trim away any excess tricot on the right side of the hood section. With right sides together, pin the two hood sections matching the dots, shoulders, and center back. Stitch the two sections together with a 3/4 inch or 2 centimeter seam allowance. Trim the seam allowance that does not have the tricot finish to 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter. Press the seam allowances to one side with the tricot finish on top. Watch the iron temperature as the tricot can melt. Use a tailor's ham to help with the tight curve. We will now create a reverse flat fell or felled seam by folding the tricot finished edge under 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. You shouldn't see the tricot. Having used the tricot to draw up the curve, it should turn under nicely around the curved seam. Top stitch the seam allowance down through all layers. Fold the long front edge to the inside of the hood along the fold line, which will form a 1¼ inch or 3.1 centimeter self-facing. You might remember that this is exactly the dimension of the front neck placket. That is not a coincidence. If you had created a seam allowance because the selvage wasn't available as a finished edge, turn it under and press before turning back the self-facing. Hand baste this self-facing in place. Now we get to attach our hood. With right sides together, pin the hood to the tunic neckline, keeping the yoke facing out of the way. Match the dots and keep the front plackets opened out. The front edge of the hood should be even with the front placket fold line. Fold each placket back, right sides together, encasing the front edges of the hood. Clip the back neck seam allowance only if necessary. It will be covered by the yoke facing. Stitch a 5/8 inch or 1.5 centimeter neck seam. Again, keep the yoke facing folded back out of the way. To reduce bulk in the front placket area, trim the front corners and grade the placket seam allowances only. Turn the plackets right side out. Press the hood and neck seam allowances towards the tunic, away from the hood. The yoke facing will cover those seam allowances from the shoulders across the back. But we need to do something with the seam allowances from the front plackets to the shoulders. Grab some more tricot and finish off those seam allowances, treating them as one. Now we can do the final top stitching from the bottom of the placket up around the hood and back down the other side. We will do this on both edges of the plackets, catching in the front folds of the placket and hood as well. On this tunic, I opted not to top stitch those areas. Instead, I chose to hand stitch everything in place. That is certainly an option. It depends on how much you like hand stitching. For now, my plan is to hand stitch this area on the wool plaid, as I did on this wool tunic. Now we get to finish the yoke facing. Pin the yoke facing to the wrong side of the garment, matching the shoulder seam lines and covering the shoulder seam allowances. Fold under the neck seam allowance of the yoke facing, clipping the seam allowance if necessary, for a smooth fit. The yoke facing will cover the hood and tunic back neck seam allowances. Hand stitch the yoke facing in place. Baste the yoke armhole edges together. Next time, I'll have all the hand stitching completed, and I'll be finishing up the tunic by inserting the sleeves. Remember, I'm making the drop shoulder version of this tunic, the 1700 pattern. So the sleeve installation is different than a set-in sleeve. I'm Daryl Lancaster for the Weaver Sews.